Tens of thousands of people have demonstrated in an eighth night in cities across the US over the killing of an unarmed black man, George Floyd, while he was being restrained by police. The mainly peaceful marches took place in Los Angeles, Atlanta, New York and Washington, some in defiance of evening curfews. In George Floyd's hometown of Houston, his relatives, including the mother of his young daughter, joined a rally to honour his memory. Neda Taufik reports.
This is what those officers took from me. He would never see her grow up, graduate. He would never walk her down the aisle. If it's a problem she's having and she needs her dad, she does not have that anymore.
Choked with emotion, the mother of George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter, Gianna, speaks of the gaping hole left by his death. Roxy Washington said he was a good father who continued to take care of his family after he moved from Houston to Minneapolis. What she wants now is justice for him and Gianna. Sharing in their pain and the pain of the nation, tens of thousands marched through the streets of downtown Houston. Alongside them, 16 members of the Floyd family, who again urged protesters to remain peaceful.
They're expecting you to behave unbecomingly. They're expecting you to carry yourself like a fool. But we don't have to do that. Once again, look around. We all we got. Let me even say that. We all we got. We all we got. We all we got.
The fight is going to be more like a marathon, and we hope that y'all continue to support us as we seek justice for our cousin and our brother.
One victory to come out of the demand for widespread change. The state where Mr. Floyd died, Minnesota, announced a civil rights investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department. Governor Tim Walz said that police policies and practices over the last 10 years would be scrutinized.
Minnesotans, you can expect our administration to use every tool at our disposal to try and deconstruct systemic racism that is generations deep. And as we move forward, we're going to need to do it with the community. But I think the thing I'm hearing from the protesters is we're not watching and we don't care what you say. We care what you do.
Protests across the country showed no sign of waning Tuesday night. In New York's Union Square, nurses took to their knees to show solidarity with activists. Healthcare workers have been cheered daily for their efforts fighting the coronavirus, but they thought it more appropriate to applaud and honor those fighting a different kind of disease.
After months of eerily quiet streets, New York, once the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak, is finally starting to reopen. But as it does, American cities are facing another epidemic, racism, and the consequences of ignoring decades of injustice and inequality. Neda Taufik, BBC News, New York.
Well, let's take you live to New York now. We can speak to another of our correspondents, Samira Hussein, who is there for us. What's your assessment of the evening, Samira? It seemed less violent.
Well, if you want to speak about New York specifically, the violence was not really as present as we'd seen, especially on Monday night. According to police, there were only about 200 arrests, and that was largely due to violating curfew. Remember, in New York City, the mayor of New York had actually put in a curfew to begin at 8 p.m., and it was going to continue for the next several days. And already we're hearing from officials that perhaps that actually did help kind of quell the kind of violence and looting that we had seen on other nights. There were protests right across the country, from Dallas to Seattle and Atlanta, and it was the same scenes in those cities too. There were lots of protests, lots of people in the streets, lots of people violating curfews, but in large part, the protests were peaceful.
Is there a sense, though, in New York, Samira, that the protests are coming to an end?
Certainly not. Just because we've already seen violence starting to come down and we're not seeing the kind of looting that we had seen on Monday, there is no sense that the anger that these protesters have is going to abate anytime soon. For many of these protesters, they need to see some kind of action, some kind of movement, some kind of some sort of justice. And until you see that, it's not very likely that we're going to see these protests abate anytime soon.
Samira, thanks so much for joining us from New York. And from New York to the streets of London, live right now, we can show you what is happening here in the UK, where there is a Black Lives Matter protest taking place. This is central London, Hyde Park, where protesters and activists have gathered to and I think you can see a reasonable amount of social distancing happening there too, because there are still huge concerns here about COVID-19, of course. But it's a Black Lives Matter protest, and everyone attending has been told to move in a socially distanced military formation. So this is the scene live in Hyde Park right now. People there expressing solidarity with what they are seeing in the United States.